Happy Friday. John Lorden here with another episode of BrainScratch. Thank you so much for joining me here today. And this is a little bit of a special episode for me because this is a topic I covered very heavily. As a matter of fact, this topic started BrainScratch more than 4 years ago, and I don't cover it a whole lot. It's something I always keep an eye on. It's kind of part of the makeup of who I am in terms of being on YouTube. It's a case that is certainly responsible for this channel's growth, but it's also something that really strikes to my core in terms of topics that I care about. That's, of course, the Elisa Lam case. 4 years ago this week, I released my final video analyzing the case of Elisa Lam, at least for BrainScratch. I had a couple of kind of one-off episodes in terms of itchy mysteries where I would review media that was released on Elisa. This is going to be kind of a mix of both of those. Essentially, there's some new media that has come out. There's some other new media that's coming out. And one of the micro mysteries in this big tangled web of mysteries has been solved. So we're certainly going to cover that on today's video. But 4 years ago, that last video I released was called The Final Word on Elisa Lam. And you can see there's a question mark on that because honestly, I didn't know if it was going to be the final word or not. That video basically talked about my experience of being in the courtroom at the wrongful death suit for the one day that case would be heard of by a judge or heard by a judge. It was my 14th video on the subject, and it capped off a year of me looking into this case, a year of trying to move this conversation away from an internet ghost story or a creepypasta. I don't know if we even use that term anymore, and really trying to pull this thing into reality and see what we could learn about this case through that lens. I decided after that video was posted that I didn't have anything new to add to the conversation, but I had left that significant trail of information for anyone else to follow that really wanted to dig in and search for the truth. Now, of course, there's been all kinds of different things that have happened. YouTube has had an eruption of people in this true crime area. A lot of other people have covered this case. There's a lot of people looking for a good story, but unfortunately, not all the time are they looking for the truth. Sometimes they will hit the version of this story that really grabs an audience, and their research seems to stop there, and they won't press further to actually check those facts. And we know some of those facts are incorrect. For example, the hatch on the water tank. We know that the hatch on the water tank was actually off. So it's boggles my mind that I'll see someone, release current media on this, and it still goes down that speculation path of, ooh, well, how did the hatch get back on the water tank? At least with information that we have from legal documents coming directly from employees that were there, specifically Santiago Lopez, the employee that found her body, he says the hatch was actually off. So that whole part of the mystery that keeps getting spun around even years after my videos have been put out seems to keep popping back up in these certain retellings that I think are just wanting to lean more to being compelling stories than actually looking for the truth in this case, which I do find a little frustrating, just to be quite honest with you guys. There's enough about this case that is strange. There's enough about this case that it really deserves looking into. We've got an emotional health aspect that rides heavy through this case. We have medication that could be talked about with this case as well. This case is so much more than a creepy elevator video and a story about a girl in a water tank where how did the lid get put back on. There's so much more to it if people really take the time, but they don't always take the time. Of course, anytime a new piece of media on this case kicks out, I get notified by a ton of people. My phone starts ringing, I get emails, I get comments, and I usually will try to watch that media, kind of keeping an open mind. I know people are coming into this story. Sometimes they don't have as much time. I mean, it took me a year to get to that point, a year of working really hard on this case to get to the point of understanding that I had at that time. But what I'm hoping for is that when people will take on this case, that they'll go through, and not just my analysis, there was other great web sleuths that helped with the understanding of that, and I credited them as I was making my videos, but that people will go to those sources and review the information for themselves and then carry that forward and then make some new discoveries. And that's probably one of the more disappointing things. Is there's a lot of times where I'm watching new media on this and there is nothing in terms of discoveries. There's nothing that's really moving the conversation forward. Every now and then, that's not the case. And that's what I keep holding out hope for. And that's why I keep reviewing every piece of media basically that comes out on this case. There's been such good work done by so many web sleuths on this. And now we're starting to see mainstream media pick up this story and start to run with it, of course, years after. And don't get me wrong. I mean, mainstream media was there at the start. There was news coverage about this case all over the place. But what really propelled it, at least from my point of view, is the internet. I don't think this story would be getting all the coverage it is now if it wasn't for the internet component, the fact that this thing went completely viral. Anytime I consume a new piece of media on this case, I feel a little tug of war going on inside of me. I watch these things and it feels like certain elements of the media will feel like they're pulling towards storytelling. And then other elements will be like, oh, good, they're finally looking for the truth, or they're trying to get some expert analysis that helps develop our understanding of this case. And it kind of swings between those 2 points. It could be a little nerve-wracking for me personally watching this kind of stuff. Of course, finally, over the past few years, it has caught the attention of some of the big players in terms of mainstream media. Investigation Discovery had that feature, Horror at the Cecil Hotel, which I thought was actually pretty compelling retelling of the event. Certainly leaned more to that side of being a piece of entertainment. A couple things that kind of helped us understand things a little bit, probably more about the hotel than actually about that particular event. But I thought it was decent. It did have a few factual problems, particularly with her story, and I really felt like it lacked experts. Well, 2 weeks ago, HLN has taken their turn with this story, and they've released it on a show called Real Life Nightmare. The episode is called Deadly Hotel Check-In. And some of those things I was talking about, a few factual problems and lacking experts from the Investigation Discovery show, I do think are rectified in this, certainly in terms of experts. But you got to be sure to check the quality of those experts. We're going to get into that as we go through this. So what side of the tug of war does Real Life Nightmare ultimately wind up on? I'm going to let you guys determine that for yourself as I tell you about some of the discrepancies I noted, the good, the bad, and the questionable. And I certainly think there was a few things that were questionable. But keep in mind, they did solve one of the micro mysteries in this whole web, which I think does help move the conversation forward. And I'm really thankful that they were able to do that. On top of that, of all this new media that I've consumed on this case, which one is my favorite? I'm going to tell you about that at the end of the episode as well. So let's get into the good, the bad, and the questionable on Real Life Nightmare. So essentially, in terms of experts, I thought they did a pretty good job pulling together a compelling group. They have an LA historian named Hadley Mears. They have a CNN reporter, Kyung La, who actually reported on it back at the time, and a former FBI agent, Harold Kopis, who really, for me, is like the voice of reason in this whole piece, which I'm thankful for because there's some other voices that really need a good voice of reason in a piece like this. The CNN reporter, I thought, did an excellent job just kind of relaying her experience, being, boots on the ground around this happening and what she noticed. And the LA historian, I think, is a nice touch as well and might help provide us with a little more emotional connection. I think really Hadley and Kyung are what I consider the heart of the piece in terms of having some form of emotional connection to Elisa. It's kind of strange because we also have a forensic psychologist, and I feel like there's no emotional connection through her to Elisa, which really blows my mind. But let's start talking about the experts that are featured. The first expert is this man right here. He is a retired LAPD homicide detective, Greg Kading. Now, here is a quote from Wikipedia about why you might know him. In September 2011, he self-published the book Murder Rap: The Untold Story of the Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur Murder Investigations. In it, he included new evidence in the rapper's murders and said he implicated entertainment mogul Sean Combs and CEO of Death Records, Suge Knight. He was also on the task force that was actually investigating that case. So I got to tell you guys, honestly, I struggle a bit with law enforcement turned authors. I'm not saying that this is about all of them, but I'm saying I've had several examples where I've been in direct contact with them, or I've looked into work that they've put out, and there's like a switch that seems to flip with them sometimes, that when they become authors, it's not that the facts aren't as important, but for some reason it's like they get so focused on selling the book that the story seems to get remolded or kind of changed around a little bit. Now, I can't tell you if that's what we have going on in this case. I have not read his book, but I do think it's interesting that he actually worked on that case and wrote that book. I think that makes a lot of sense. In his use for Real Life Nightmare, it's a little different because he's commenting on a case that, from what I can tell, actually what I'm pretty certain he didn't work on, because he was retired at the time of Elisa's story. So everything seems to be coming from him from a place of him possibly reviewing the case file. I'm a little interested about that as well, and I wonder if the production actually did some type of double check on that. I can't tell you guys how many times I've spoken to people in law enforcement or connected to law enforcement, or people that have professional affiliations with law enforcement that have attempted to access any information about this case, and were not only told no, we're told no and don't ask. Just do not go down this road. For some reason, this guy seems to have gone down that road, read the book, and come back. So I'm a bit curious how that happens. Maybe it's just he was at the right place at the right time, knew the right person, got the right access. Ultimately, I found his information pretty solid. There was one thing I wasn't sure of. He said that there was 2 ways to the rooftop: the interior stairwell that led to the supposedly alarmed door, and then the fire escape. I do believe there's another fire escape. I'm not 100% sure if it actually has the final ladder to get to the rooftop, but I know there are 2 different fire escapes. Something interesting that he pointed out is he says that the dogs, when they were searching for her, actually got a hit at the window that leads to the fire escape. Now, I'm not completely surprised by that, because if you've actually been in those hallways for yourself, those windows kind of attract attention because they're the only way that you can really see outside from inside those hallways. The hallways are just long corridors of literally doors. And when you look down towards the end, all of a sudden there's this big bright light that comes shining through because that window is there. As a matter of fact, if you go with a dog and check the Cecil, I'm sure you'd find my scent at those windows as well. And I haven't crawled out onto the fire escape. So I don't know that that necessarily tells us that she did use the fire escape in particular. It's possible, but he also then notes that they didn't get any further hits up on the rooftop. They can't really explain, how she got into the water tank, which of course we've heard them talk about before. The alarm, he is talking about the fact that, supposedly the alarm is checked, and that when it rings, you should hear it on those top 2 floors and down at the front desk. Of course, if you guys have watched my video series, you know that I went there with someone that actually went up and went through the alarmed door, and it didn't go off at that time. That's not to say that that wasn't maybe some type of special condition. Maybe they were doing some testing, or they had to replace the battery in it, or had some technical problem or something like that. And it was, a few years after the fact. So not exactly a great test, but at least when we tested the alarm, it actually didn't work. Now, when he talks about the tank lid, he mentions a latch, and I don't know what he's talking about. There is now a latching mechanism on it. There wasn't at the time. This was a big point of contention in the actual lawsuit. I was sitting there listening to them debate this. I thought it was a pretty weak argument, actually, on the Cecil's behalf. They were saying that because of the fact that this was a big metal plate that just sits on top, that there was no way to lock it, which really doesn't make sense, because with a latch, kind of like what Greg Kading is saying, you could lock it at two separate places, and that would effectively lock it on there even if it wasn't hinged, which we know it wasn't hinged. Let me also be very clear about that. So I'm kind of curious what he's talking about with the latch. According to the information we heard at the lawsuit, there was no latch there at all. Thankfully, they are at least acknowledging Santiago Lopez's story that it was open when she was discovered. So at least that part of the mystery that typically gets repeated time and time again, particularly in social media that's recounting this, thankfully is corrected. They're going with, well, is at least in line with what the official legal documents and employee statements say from a deposition. He does state that, according to the case file specifically, that the rape kit did get processed, but nothing was found. So that's certainly some new information, certainly moves the story forward a little bit, because there's still people speculating that there might have been some type of sexual assault here. As a matter of fact, one of the experts can't really get his mind off that theory. He keeps driving at it time and time again. But at least according to what we're hearing from Kading here, he says he's reviewed the case file. He says a rape kit was processed and that nothing was found. Expert number 2 is forensic psychologist Cheryl, and I hope I'm saying her last name right, Arutt or Arutt. I don't think they actually pronounced it in the special. They just had it show up on the splash screen down below. Of course, I think a forensic psychologist, very important component to doing an analysis of this case. I worry, after seeing what she presented, that she wasn't actually prepped properly for this case. And I don't know whose responsibility that is. I can tell you, we've had experts come on to shows that I've produced, and we will usually provide them with source information. You know, if that's autopsy reports, whatever, police reports, we'll provide them with that info. I don't know how much responsibility actually falls on them in terms of digging into that info with a case like this one, the Elisa Lam case, where there's so much public information. Whichever direction it's supposed to go, I feel like she really was not properly prepared to have a conversation about this case. She says there's no signs of depression, which completely blows my mind, because if you take the time to actually look into Elisa's social media, it's very clear that she's struggling with depression. But for some reason, we have a forensic psychologist here saying that there's no signs of that. There's a ton of social media documentation on that between Elisa's own words and then, of course, everyone reciting Elisa's words or doing further analysis on that. So I really don't know how that conclusion comes out. There also doesn't seem to be any consideration for possibly manic phases that Elisa could be going through, or any issues with her medication not being taken properly. Quite honestly, it doesn't even seem like she's all that familiar with what's going on in the elevator video. A quote directly from her is, "Just because someone has bipolar disorder doesn't mean they're suicidal." Once again, I'm wondering what she's thinking about this case, because no one has claimed that this is a suicide. Even the coroner's report is citing this as an accident, or the autopsy report is citing this as an accidental death. So I don't know where that point's coming at all. And it's just so clear if you look into Elisa's own words. She's clearly dealing with depression. She talks about it regularly. I would imagine that this expert should have at least been reviewing the medications that she was on. There's really no talk about those medications. I think there's maybe just a little touch on them, but nothing too deep. It's kind of very passive. It's almost like this expert is here saying, you know, well, it's not any of this. It's nothing that falls under what I cover. But if you look at Elisa's words for herself, it tells a very, very different story. I think that's probably the weakest point in the information they released, is they completely missed the aspect of talking about emotional disorders, talking about medication issues that can happen when trying to treat those emotional disorders. in a way, I find it minorly, and I don't want to make a huge deal out of this, but I find it somewhat disrespectful to Elisa with the message she was actually trying to put out herself leading up to all of this. I don't know how you don't address that properly, but for some reason in this special, it really doesn't get addressed properly. Then there is expert number 3, John Heiser, and I know I'm probably getting his name wrong. This was probably the most frustrating aspect of watching this special. We have someone that is a forensic pathologist, says that he's done thousands of autopsies. And one of the big things that he clings onto in this story is there's no water found in the lungs. He doesn't mention the possibility of dry drowning, which I'm sure many of you out there know is a natural reaction that can happen when the body does detect that it's in a situation where you could be drowning. Your throat can literally close up and effectively you suffocate to death, and your lungs do not necessarily fill with water. He doesn't talk about that aspect at all. He also thinks that someone can apparently be murdered outside of the water and not have any discernible marks or damage done to the body. And I do think that there might be some considerations where you could talk about that. For example, if you knew that she was drugged in some way where she was, not conscious, and then someone used a pillow or something along those lines. He's really caught on the theory that there was a sexual assault here, which at least according to what we heard from the homicide detective certainly isn't the case, and that it had to do with a pillow suffocation. But we know that there's really no fight marks, no damage found to her body, literally 2 little tiny nicks on her knees that might have happened if she did climb up the ladder on the side and was getting up onto the roof. There's no ligature marks. There's no petechial hemorrhaging that was noted, which also should happen even with a pillow suffocation. But then you also have to keep in mind we're talking about a body that has been sitting in the water for 3 weeks. So there's also a lot of evidence that is basically literally decomposing away. I did look into his background a little bit. He's someone that seems to pop up with these kind of, I don't want to say they're controversial, but he kind of has these statements where he shows up in these big cases. First of all, he showed up in this one back in an article on CBS years ago. He also popped up in the Sandra Bland case. Do you guys remember when all that stuff was kicking around about, oh my God, she's really dead in the booking photo? Yeah, he wanted to comment on that case too. And basically his comments always come back to, well, you can never know for sure. Well, I can't say for certain that she's really dead in that photo. I can't say she's alive in that photo. He's just this person that kind of always leaves things open-ended. Very strange for someone in his profession. I get that there needs to be a certain amount of restraint, and you can't always assume that conclusions that you're headed towards are necessarily solid until you verify them. But man, he seems to live in this kind of middle area where it made me pretty uncomfortable seeing the information that he was presenting in this. And unfortunately, pretty much the whole, what I consider the third act of this 1 hour special is really him making these points and then other people debunking certain aspects of those points. But for some reason, they give this guy a ton of camera time. He also gets caught up on the body position, the fact that she is found floating up, which certainly is a strange condition. I've talked about this also on the videos that I did on this case, but he doesn't take into account that we're not dealing with a stagnant water level here. We're dealing with this water tank that is constantly being used. The water is constantly lowering and then it's refilling from another feed. It's constantly going up and down. And also consider the shape of what she's in. She's in a tube essentially. So making an assumption that, hey, 9 times out of 10 when we find a body, it's face down. That might be true if you're talking about water sources where it's wide open and there's currents and there's natural things that are going on. In a closed container like this, you've got some different things happening, and especially with the water level rising up and down over and over, and there's only a certain circumference. It could be that depending on where she's floating, if she's bumping up against one of the sides, that could be prohibiting her body from rolling over like you would normally expect. And it's also a numbers game. Yes, in the majority, you're going to find that the body's floating face down, but it's not 100%. So is it worth talking about in a case like this? Yes, but then analyze the rest of it. Do some tests, get another water tank, throw a dummy in there, have the water level change over and over and see if that actually gets the body to roll. There's things that can be done to help with this. And I would expect a production of this size to actually go that far if you want to go down this path. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite happen. He's also talking about how it's unexplainable that she was found naked. He doesn't mention paradoxical undressing, which is something that it is a real thing. People sometimes when they're drowning or if they're freezing in particular, will take off their clothes. They feel like all of a sudden their skin is burning. It's a natural nervous reaction that happens within their body, and they pull the clothes off. Also, no mention here about the possibility that she was using the clothes. If you're in a tank like that, and you notice that something's happening to the water level, particularly if it's taking you away from the hatch that can get you out of there, which I assume it would be. People are using the water down in the hotel when this is going on. So I imagine at some point that water level starts lowering. You're going to wonder how it's lowering, why it's lowering, and then you might see something that's refilling it, and you might try to do something to either stop the water that's going out so that when it starts refilling, maybe it'll get you high enough to get out of the hatch, or you might use something to try to block the incoming water. What do you have to work with? The only thing you have are your clothes. So for me, the fact that she's found naked, I think there is a lot of reasonable explanations. I personally don't find it completely unexplainable as he seems to find it. So I looked into Dr. Heiser's background. I actually looked into everyone's background. He's the only one that came back with some questionable things when I did a very simple Google search on him. The first thing was, it was a charge of scientific misconduct that was filed against him in March of 1994 by the National Institutes of Health. And here's a direct quote from their final findings. An investigation conducted by the Office of Research Integrity found that Dr. Heiser deliberately and knowingly falsified 4 figures and 1 table in 2 research grant applications submitted to the National Institutes of Health, and deliberately and knowingly fabricated a laboratory notebook to cover up the falsifications in the grant applications. From what I can tell from these final findings, they actually stopped him from being able to file grants altogether at that time. Now, of course, you're talking 1994. You're like, hey, that's a while ago. Maybe he's a different person now. Maybe not into the whole scientific misconduct area anymore. I also found some reviews of his work over at www.vitals.com. The title of the first one, which was posted on September 16th, 2019, is Complete Failure. I hired Dr. Heiser in the summer of 2017 and sent him a $2,000 check as the initial retainer for his expert witness services in a forensic pathology case. He cashed the check and never performed any services for me. He does not respond to me at all, never wrote a report, and never refunded my money. I'm an attorney in Las Vegas, Nevada. And then he even went so far as to put his name on there as well. Another review from August 31st, 2018, titled Predatory Fraudulent Practices, Buyer Beware. His lab recently did a genetic test recommended by our local doctor who told us it would be either a $10 copay or $200 max out of pocket. We never received results from them. And 9 months later, we received a bill for over $17,800, of which our insurance company had paid $1,800. This is fraudulent billing, and you should avoid this doctor at all costs. These practices should be outlawed. This is what is driving up your insurance costs every year. Finally, one posted on May 17th, 2018. He's a thief and a liar who only cares about money and will say and do anything to make a dollar. It was just a Google search, folks. Quite honestly, I wouldn't even use him as an expert on my YouTube channel or one of my podcasts. And I can't believe that he was given so much screen time. And his comments are just so, it's not that they're completely unfounded. They're just not challenged. They're not well thought out. There's no consideration for the other factors that could affect what the points that he's trying to make. Very, very disappointing, I think is the best word that I can say. Thankfully, there is at least another bright spot in this coverage, and that is this man right here, Dr. William Maroney. He's the medical examiner for Bay County, Michigan, and he pretty handily counters Dr. Heiser's weak points. They don't give him nearly as much screen time, and I almost think that they should have got the two of them together to hash it out. I think that would have really led to some interesting conversation. He does make a really, really good point about the water in the lungs, which is just that basically at the point of decomposition that she was at, that you really couldn't expect to use that as a good gauge of figuring out if drowning is a factor or not. And even when it comes to the drowning analysis, he makes a great comment. This is literally the quote, that they basically backed into that decision. It was a default. So he's basically just saying, with the information they had available, that was the default decision that they could make about what actually happened. Now, Dr. Heiser wrote, his opinion would have been more along the lines of, well, if you can't tell for certain, then, and for certain, which seems to be his angle, then it should have been noted as an undetermined, which honestly, I'm kind of on the fence of. I think it could have been noted as undetermined as well. Although, when you think about that aspect, about this being kind of a default decision, when you don't have any indicators of physical fighting that have been going on, or an attack of some kind, there's really nothing to point in that direction. And there was nothing in terms of the evidence that at least has been publicly revealed that really points in that direction either. So when you think about these decisions that they have to make when they're, filling out this sheet and saying, hey, we need to check a box. Is this an accident or is this undetermined? And of course, we know there's a little discrepancy that happens on Elisa's particular report where it looks like both were checked, at least at one point, and then one was X'd out before it was set to accidental death. I do think that it's worth having that debate, but when you consider all the evidence here, it's really hard for me to say that it shouldn't have been marked accidental as opposed to could not be determined. Because if you could rule out that there was someone else at play, that there was some other nefarious thing at play, which maybe we're not ruling it out with 100% certainty, but we're seriously stacking the deck against that with the information that's actually available. I could see why they kind of went that way. Wouldn't it be great if they actually had an expert on that to talk about this? Believe it or not, HLN actually pulls it out, and they do. We'll get to him soon. Other people featured, for some reason, I don't know why, they featured a registered sex offender. And they effectively did it only for a gross out pass on the fact that people were consuming the water or bathing in the water. I don't know why you would do that. It's really not. Is it really worth it? And they actually hit that kind of the gross water aspect of this story 3 separate times, and they hit it really, really hard each time. Look, we get it. Okay, we know that this is not a great situation for everyone that's in the building, but guess what? It's a far worse situation for the person in the water tank, and it's a terrible situation for her family. But to bring up a registered sex offender in the footage there just so you can feature, oh, look, this guy popped up on the news and he was able to show them the gray water that was coming out of the faucet. Not a decision I would have gone with. They did also reach out to Katie Orphan, the owner of the Last Bookstore, and got some pretty good interviews with her. Nothing really new to add. She has a little more perspective than she's actually put out. I'm remembering quotes of hers that came out from back at the time, and she literally restates those things almost word for word. Then she gives just a little additional, kind of what she thinks on top of it. Nothing really all that compelling, but I'm happy that she actually participated with the production and helped add some, not really detail, but just another level to this. There's something that struck me when I was listening to her talk, and we're talking about Elisa interacting with her during the day I can't really remember the time off the top of my head, but if I remember right, I think it was around noon or 1, somewhere around there. And then whatever happening to Elisa happening to her far later that night. We know that there's medication that's involved here. We know that she was out with a few other guys, or at least came into the hotel with 2 other men. We don't know what that's about at all. As a matter of fact, that is not brought up in this HLN special at all. But it occurred to me that yes, Katie's insight into what Elisa was like is interesting. It's interesting that Katie wouldn't have noted, oh my God, this girl was manic, or, she was bouncing off the walls. But we're also talking about a pretty good time gap there between Elisa's actual elevator footage, and who knows what happened in between that. It's not like Katie interacted with her 15 minutes before the elevator footage. We're talking hours and hours and hours. So that's one thing that just kind of popped up in my mind when I saw Katie being interviewed and with the information that she was adding. Now, probably the best of the interviews that they got was Jason Tovar, who is the person that actually performed the autopsy. However, they don't really seem to take advantage of it. They do solve one minor mystery, and that's what I've been teasing you guys in this video, and that is about the date discrepancy on the final determination. He is very clear that what people think is a 5 is actually an 8. And that is something that we talked about on the channel as well. So basically, there's no mystery there. He said that happened at the same time. That's why those 2 dates are the 18th, and that is that. Unfortunately, they didn't ask one of the most important questions, or if they did, they didn't include whatever his answer was. Why did this autopsy take so long? We're talking 4 months before that information actually came out. So we have and it could be that there's something very reasonable. It could be that, hey, there was a bunch of lab tests that they had to wait for the results for, but we don't know, because either they didn't ask it or they didn't include the information if they did. He does also talk about the sediment in the tank. And the only comment he really makes about that, in terms of there's another micro mystery, what is that white particulate that's found on her clothing, is that it was not determined by myself. That's literally his words about it. I wish they would have driven in a little bit more about, okay, well, what happens with that? Is that tested by someone else? What's the rest of the process for that, and what happened through that process? But unfortunately, we don't get any of that. Of course, during the sediment talk, they kick back to Dr. Heiser, and he's making a comment about how is there sediment on there, because effectively it would have been like she was washing the clothes. I mean, think about your clothes coming off in a tank of water and you're kicking them off. You would have kicked all the sediment off of it. I don't know how he makes the assumption that that's how the clothes came off. And I don't think it is a very strong assumption. Again, we're really boiling it down to there's probably a few different sources that could be that white sediment. First of all, it could be something that's in the tank already. I don't know if you guys have a kettle that you use, but you'll see calcium deposits, and sometimes if you don't wash them often enough, there's stuff that will actually kind of collect, and you'll have sediment in the bottom of that. So it could be that there was sediment in the bottom of the tank. There was the roofing material, kind of this white sandy particulate that's all over the roof up there. If she did climb up a side ladder and had to get on her, effectively climb up on her chest and her knees to get onto the rooftop, she might have transferred some of that onto her clothing. And then on top of all that, she also did take a trip to the beach. So it could just be sand from the beach that was stuck to her clothes and it wound up in there. Yeah, the whole washing the clothes comment, once again, I don't know where this guy's coming from, unless he's literally just trying to think of what comment can I make to be so interesting right now, and this will actually get in. And it amazes me because he got a ton of content into this thing that I don't think really should be there. Other major misses in their coverage, I gotta say, the biggest one for me is bipolar disorder, really not talking about the realities of that, not talking about the struggles with that. It's kind of super briefly mentioned. it's probably, if you actually dig into this case, if you look into the information that she was putting out herself, it's probably the most worthwhile and important discussion to have about Elisa Lam. And this special completely skirts it. It's almost like this special is scrubbed about that whole, it's not quite completely scrubbed. There is a little bit of talk about it, but it is extremely light. I don't feel like they had an expert on that, even though they had a forensic psychologist. I don't think that they had her prepped properly, and for some reason that aspect is completely missed. For fans of David Paulides, I know he has a version of this story as well where he talks about the fact that all the blood was drained from her body. I've addressed that in previous videos. If you look into the decomposition of a body in the water, it is not abnormal for the liquids to actually leave the body. But they didn't touch on that at all in this. There's no mention of the other footage that they had of her entering the hotel with the two men in the box. No mention about that at all. There's no mention of the roommates that complained about her behavior or really even her room arrangements. When she first got there, she was staying in what they consider like their communal rooms or like a hostel. It was a room where you were essentially renting a bed and you're sharing it with other people. The other people complained about her so much, the hotel assigned her to a private room, and they assigned her to the private room on the day where she actually would wind up going missing. None of those details come through in this special at all. There's nothing about the timestamp on the video or the edits that happen in the video. There's no mention of the mirror that you can see from the elevator. All those weird motions, and when it looks like she's talking to someone outside the door, there's literally a mirror right across the hall. No mention about that. Not even a decent shot of the hallway, the layout of the floors, nothing like that. They also make a really big mystery of her cell phone. I'm pretty sure that comes from the special that ID did on this, the Horror at the Cecil Hotel special, because they also made a big deal about her cell phone. We know that she lost a cell phone in San Diego. It happened days before. And even this special comments on the fact that she's been out of contact with her family, who she normally spoke to daily, for about 6 days. So the cell phone thing, I know previously I've talked about the fact, I think there's 2 cell phones. I think she borrowed a BlackBerry from a friend. She was doing that for social media purposes, effectively to have a camera so that she could take pictures as she was going on this trip and do some posts to social media. I believe that's the one that she lost in San Diego. I think her other phone was likely a simple phone, not a smartphone. And they make a big deal out of it because you have the detective that's talking about this case saying he doesn't want to comment on the cell phone. The FBI expert that they hired for this show makes a really good comment about it. He's like, you know what? It probably got stolen. They probably don't want to talk about it because it got, stolen by someone, and it's not really a part of this. We do know she had moved her stuff to that private room. She went missing, and the hotel moved her personal items down into an area in the basement. So is it possible at that time that the cell phone disappeared? Maybe. She also had a laptop with her. I believe that was actually recovered. It's also possible that police just have it and they just don't want to comment about it for some reason. Keep in mind, this is not an open case file that everyone's been able to review and really dissect. So there's certain aspects of this case where sometimes you're going to hit a black hole and you might not have a reasonable explanation. I kind of think that's what we have with the cell phone. They had literally one sentence about the wrongful death lawsuit. Didn't talk about any of the considerations that went on there. Didn't talk about the fact that you had a judge talk about what his ruling was going to be before the argument was even made in media before. Have you guys ever seen that before? A judge making comments to media about how he's going to rule on something literally before the arguments are presented? That's what happened in that lawsuit. And a really big black hole in their coverage on this is web sleuths. Like I said earlier, yes, this story starts with the media. There's reporters all over it, but this story exploded because of the internet, because of the elevator footage, and because of even the creepypasta angle and all the ghost stories, all that stuff that sprung up because of it. How you can try to address this story without talking about that aspect, particularly when Elisa herself was so engaged with social media and sharing herself that way. I think is just a giant miss. And of course, that's something else here. Honestly, that list is just scratching the surface. All in all, I'd say this thing is moderately entertaining if you know nothing about the story, which, let's be honest, at this point, who doesn't know about this story? But it's largely incomplete. We do solve that one micro mystery about the dates. Other than that, we hear about the dogs potentially getting a hit at the window. So a couple of new nuggets to kind of help our understanding of the case. Are they big parts to the case? I mean, that's really up to you and your perspective about what you think is the most important thing to focus on here. A lot of wasted opportunities with the interviews that they actually did get. And then, of course, you have that third act that is the motor of that third act is Dr. Heiser. And his analysis is just, it turned me into a bobblehead. My head was just shaking so much watching all that. If you're really looking for a great retelling and you don't have the 12 or 15 hours or whatever to go through my whole playlist on it, check out Stephanie Harlowe's recent video. And if you do want to dig in, I'll also have a link to my Elisa Lam playlist. Both of those can be found in the description box below. So there's something else I promised you guys. What is the best media that I've seen kick out about Elisa Lam? And hands down, easy. It is the book Gone at Midnight. Now, I read an advanced copy of it. It actually hasn't been released yet, but I have a link to the Amazon listing for it down below. It's being released February 25th, 2020. It's written by Jake Anderson. He worked on The Ghost Diaries. I've worked with him on Elisa Lam related projects for several years. The perspective that he hits in retelling her story, particularly with coping with emotional disorders, working in what's going on with the Cecil Hotel and all of that history, LAPD and that history, what's going on with Skid Row, what's going on with the tuberculosis angle, what's going on with web sleuths and how web sleuths are developing and kind of growing around this issue as well. He fires on all cylinders on this book. I don't get anything for helping him sell copies of this book, guys. I'm just telling you, if you're really interested in this story, if you really want to get into the details and learn about this story in a different way with someone that can truly associate with the experience that she's going through, you have to hear Jake's version. It's really good. It's one of the best reads that I've had in terms of true crime. It's way up there, definitely on my top 5 for true crime books. So that is coming out very soon. Link is down below, and I might bring Jake onto the channel so we can talk a little bit more. He actually has a pretty big discovery. The discoveries that were made in this special are kind of He has a pretty major one in his book. Maybe we'll get him on the channel to talk about that right before it releases. If you do have information about a crime being committed here, the case is really closed with LAPD. The best bet, the best thing that you can do is to send it in through CrimeStoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's really the only hope that there would be for something turning this case around and changing it from the status that it's currently in. On top of that, if you're personally struggling with emotional disorders, you really don't have to do that alone. There are people that are out there willing to help you. There's a great resource. We did kind of a tribute to Elisa, and we really tried to point people towards this resource. Go to www.211unitedway.org. Or you can call 1-800-543-7709. That's here in the U.S. There's also resources all over the world. Just look for the help and get the help that you need. It is out there. Before I end today's video, a big thank you to PayPal supporters Hillary Green, Carolyn F. Nolan, Mark Witt, and Brandy Fry. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. If you would like to do the same, you could do that at lordandarts.com. You can sign up for PayPal, sign up for Patreon, buy merchandise. It all helps keep me here doing what I love doing, spending time with you guys and looking for the truth in the Elisa Lam case. And man, I don't feel like we're quite there yet, but hopefully someday we will be. I also just want to say before I end this video that it's very clear that Elisa's family didn't participate in HLN. They haven't participated in anything in terms of media creation on this story. And when you think about what they've gone through and think about what they've lost, and then think about the fact that they tried to get that wrongful death suit going, it is so clear to me that suit had nothing to do with money. Because I'm sure whatever money they were going for in the wrongful death suit, they could have made 5 or 10 times over in terms of media and appearances on this. They were looking to raise the truth about what happened to their daughter. They were looking to hopefully share that tragedy, I think, in a way where other people could learn from it. And when they saw that it wasn't going to go that way, I think it kind of scared them into silence. And I hope someday that they will feel free to speak their truths, because I do think there's a lot that we could all learn from this case. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday with a brand new episode of Case Cracked on the Lord and Arts channel.